Every day in city, street and country lane, on main road and motorway, the buses and coaches of the National Bus Company cover hundreds of thousands of miles. Over the years, the responsibility on the bus driver has grown and grown. In nearly all towns and cities, he now has to cope not only with heavier traffic, but also with highly sophisticated vehicles. It's not surprising then that today's professional bus driver regards his job as a matter of pride. Let's take a look at driver Bailey at the wheel of his Leyland National as he performs a very ordinary shift. While you look, see if there's anything you do differently. The way the driver drove that bus shortened the working life of its major components. If all buses were always driven that way, their overall working lives would be reduced by a matter of years. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go back to the beginning. That chap really knew how to make a smooth gear change, didn't he? I'm sure even the passengers appreciated the smoothness of the change. The only trouble is, the gearbox hated it. You see, what happens when you change gear in a semi-automatic box is that a pneumatic piston down here pushes one of these things, called a brake band, down onto the drum inside, and off you go. It looks like this. Now, the semi-automatic is designed to require a 2-second delay between changing gears. If you make a smart racing change, what happens is that the first band doesn't have time to disengage before the second band tries to pick up. In other words, you're trying to drive the bus in 2 gears at once, which you simply can't do. So one of the brake bands will start to slip. And that will lead to this. This brake band is severely worn. Bits of the lining material have started to come away. In really severe cases, the brake band itself will actually snap. Now, it takes 6 hours to replace a gearbox. That's a day off the road at least. It doesn't take that long in a Formula One car, but then Jackie Stewart is paid to drive that way. Now, look at this. There's a great deal to be said for using the engine as a brake. It's a good driving practice, and drivers of all kinds of vehicles frequently use it. The only trouble is that our particular driver had let the thing go to his head. You see, by missing out a complete gear on the way down, he'd forced the engine to cope with a massive increase in revs. Keep doing that for long enough and you could end up with valves like these, or a piston like this one, or a crankshaft broken as neatly as this, or if you really went to town, you could actually do that. This unit simply couldn't take the increase in revs, and it will never run again. That will cost the operating company more than your year's wages. The answer to the problem, as all really good drivers know, is to change down at the same engine and road speeds as you change up. Mind you, if you really want to wreck the whole bus, you could always try this. Did you notice the way our driver, when he was dealing with the fares, left the bus idling in gear and was holding his position on the foot brake? By itself, of course, this is a very dangerous practice because the bus could creep forward and hit somebody. But the business of idling in gear is mechanically dangerous too. You see, it'll warm up the flywheel, and that in turn will mean that the oil inside the flywheel will get hot. Now, if that goes on for long enough, then the center seal of the flywheel in there will burst and the oil will spill out. Now, fluid flywheel oil is excellent for fluid flywheels. It's also pretty good stuff when it's hot and you let it out at catching fire. Moving off in other than the prescribed first gear isn't a particularly brilliant driving practice either. It's one of those faults that leads to the dreaded brake band slip in gearboxes, and as we've seen, that can mean a gearbox rebuild. But just as bad as being in the wrong gear is being in no gear at all, coasting. Drivers sometimes coast in neutral for the best of all possible reasons. They reckon it saves fuel. It probably does, but the trouble with this kind of well-wishing is that the cost of the fuel saved is outweighed by the mechanical problems encountered. You see, when you coast the bus, you cut off the oil supply to the gearbox here. Now, just because the bus isn't in gear doesn't mean that the gearbox bearings aren't still rotating. They are. You cut off the oil supply to a rotating bearing, and you can probably guess the rest. In time, the thing will seize up. The drivetrain as a whole is also responsible for driving the steering pump. If you coast the bus in neutral there, you'll find, in most cases, that the steering will become appreciably heavier, which too isn't a very good idea. But the biggest problem with coasting in neutral is that it denies you the opportunity of using the engine as a brake at all. You see, coasting in neutral means that the air brake compressor is only being driven at idling speed. Start using the brakes a lot under those circumstances, and you're taking out of the system more than you put into it. And when you've got no air, you've got no brakes. But assuming you haven't reached this stage and you're coasting along, then you have no engine braking effect at all. So you have to rely on your wheel brakes. Now, the more you use the brakes on the wheel, the hotter they're going to get. And there's a clear relationship between heat and braking efficiency. You see, the hotter a brake system gets, the less friction there is between the linings and the brake drum. If you look at this graph, you can see that relationship mapped out. Notice how efficiency drops off as the brakes become hotter and hotter. Of course, the more you actually use the brakes, then clearly the more frequently you're going to have to renew the linings, and changing a set of linings is a good half-day's job. But in a sense, it's the heat that's the major problem, because if brakes get very hot indeed, then this little number, the hub oil seal, can burst, which means that the hub oil will flow out over the brake linings, producing that effect. And hub oil is not known for its braking capabilities. The heat will transmit through the linings into the actual brake drum itself. It will cause the drum to expand, further reducing braking efficiency, and indeed it will produce damage to the drum surface like this. You can see it's already begun to crack up there. In a really extreme case, this can happen. This brake drum has got so hot that it's actually cracked in two. The heat will go through the brake drum and into the tyre. Here we can see an otherwise quite decent tyre which has been ruined by heat, because the heat's got through into the beading. It's caused the beading to melt and to start to come away. Very dangerous indeed.